afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here on such a beautiful afternoon, but I know it's going to be worth your being inside for just a little bit. My name's Carol Ganshaft. I'm co-curator along with Deidre Hamler, who's over here, of Raggin on the Art of Aminah Brenda Lynn Robinson's House and Journals. And of course, I'm going to remind you that it's only up for one more week. It closes a week from today. So if you haven't seen it, I hope you'll get to see it today or during the week. We are closed now on Monday and Tuesday, but anything from Wednesday to Sunday will be here, and hopefully you'll have that opportunity. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Treva B. Lindsay is Associate Professor in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at The Ohio State University and founder of the Transformative Black Feminisms Initiative in Columbus. Dr. Lindsay specializes in African American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminisms, hip hop studies, critical race and gender theory, and sexual politics. She is published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the Journal of African American Studies, and African American Review, to name a few. She was the inaugural Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow at Harvard University in 2016 and 17. She is also the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including those from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, Emory University, just to name a few. She is also the current co-chair of the Women of Color Leadership Project for the National Women's Studies Association. Her first book, published in 2017 by the University of Illinois Press, Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., and that is actually her hometown, documents African American women's activism in our nation's capital. In her new book, soon to be released, America, Goddamn, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, the University of California Press, she explores the combined force of anti-Blackness, misogyny, patriarchy, and capitalism in the lives of Black women and girls in the United States today. She has written for and contributed to CNN, the Huffington Post, Billboard, the Washington Post, Vox, Al Jazeera, Cosmopolitan, and a number of others. She received a BA from Oberlin College right here in Ohio, and both her master's and PhD degrees from Duke University. In an article for Time magazine in 2020, Dr. Lindsay wrote about Black women as trailblazers for social change. For almost 7 decades, Aminah Robinson worked to produce art and writing that I believe makes her just such a trailblazer. I can think of no one in a better position and with more extensive knowledge than Dr. Lindsay to share with us her thoughts about the life and work of Aminah Brenda Lynn Robinson. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see people in the flesh, in person. So thank you for being here, and thank you to those who are here on Zoom. It is truly my pleasure to give some remarks today. I certainly will leave some time for some Q&A because I feel a lot of the richness of these conversations absolutely comes out with the questions that arise here, that arise from my remarks, from you seeing the exhibit. I certainly encourage you to see it in this next week. See it again. I've seen it 3 times, each time giving me something a little bit different. Thank you to Harold and Deidre for inviting me to be a part of this, to be in community with you all today. And I think that that's an important way to think about engaging the work of Aminah Robinson, is to be in community with how we think about it, with how we process it, with how we engage it, and with what it challenges us to do as a community, in particular in Columbus, because she was always very much so rooted in her work, in her practice, in her love practice in Columbus, and its future, its past, and what it could be, what it might be. So I titled the talk, She Made Herstory. I love this term, herstory. I've been using it quite a bit. I think a lot of people have started using it to think about the ways that women in particular change history, when we put them at the center of our narratives, what happens? What changes about how we understand a particular event, what changes about how we understand our current moment, and what changes in terms of how we think about what is possible when we put women at the center. And something that stuck out to me with Aminah Robinson is the role that women played in so many of her pieces in terms of shaping her as an artist, but also shaping the subject matter of her work. Additionally, I actually became familiar with Aminah Robinson while I was in college at Oberlin, which Carol mentioned, down the road a little bit. And of course, in its own historic way, right, the first school in the country continuously running that admitted Black women. And so Oberlin, if you were a graduate from college in the 19th century, chances are if you were a Black woman, you went to Oberlin, right? And that had, Oberlin had a very special place in my heart because of that. I've always been a little bit of a historian. Even when I was about 3 or 4, I always wanted to know the why and what came before and had those kinds of questions. And when I found out Oberlin's history, not only as an abolitionist town, a town that had this incredible history of resistance and struggle, but that there were foremothers there for me to look to, such as Mary Church Terrell and Anna Julia Cooper, who were also graduates of Oberlin College. My sophomore year, when I was an RA, I actually got to be over the room, which had a trap door to one of the crawl spaces from the Underground Railroad, right? That was this very incredible moment, but it connected me to Ohio in a particular way, and it connected me to a long history of Black women in Ohio who were doing pretty amazing and trailblazing things in a number of different arenas. And so I came to understand Ohio differently. So when I came back here in 2013, it was a pleasure again to be reconnected to Aminah Robinson and the ways that she used art to tell that kind of history. So for me, one of the most beautiful ways of thinking about how we discuss history through art. What role does art have? What role does the artist have in confronting history? And in a moment like we're in now in 2021, where there's a considerable backlash to what history should be and how history can and should be taught, art becomes one of the major vehicles by which we can interrogate, examine, re-examine, and imagine. That art is a truth-telling force, a storytelling force, and an imaginative force. And it is one that Aminah Robinson quite clearly had not only mastered, but brought something distinct to, enlivened through, right? She answered a question that had been swirling around for quite some time, even before she was born, about what the role of the Black artist should be. What role should the Black artist take in taking up history, in taking up politics, in taking up the issues of the day? Sorry. And one of the ways and one of the quotes that I was reading in the Raggin exhibit here and thinking about history and ancestry and this connection to it, right, was this aim of documenting and honoring African-American culture by exploring history and its ancestral legend. Right? Now, for me, it's the blending of these two that is so distinct about Aminah Robinson's work. History, meaning that we're going to talk about the Middle Passage, we're going to talk about slavery, we're going to talk about Jim Crow, we're going to talk about racial violence and the civil rights movement and these key moments, these key events in US history, particularly for African Americans as experienced by African Americans, but that shaped the nation largely. But it's that part about ancestral legend that really resonated with me on another level. Because often we tend to think about history and even journalism to an even greater extent as an objective truth. Such and such happened in 1894, it happened because, and that's kind of the end. That's considered the historical record. Well, what the work of Aminah Robinson in particular offers is what it means to consider the ancestral story of it, to listen to additional frequencies, Not just the historical frequencies, not just the facts of what happened that day, but why they happened, how the community was impacted by what happened, how that resonates from generation to generation to generation, and how that creates legend, myth, truth, all swirling around together, making a story. That history doesn't get the final word about interpretation. And that's particularly important when we think about how history is often taught and engaged. Now, I'm a PhD in history, so I'm gonna do my very brief historian thing real quick, then we'll move back into art. That very brief thing is that I learned from my history teacher in high school that there are three really important things to think about when thinking about history: power, perspective, and ideology, right? Who has the power to tell the story? Who has the power to write you out of that history? Who is attempting to maintain power through telling history in a particular way? Perspective. From whose perspective are we understanding a particular historical moment? Example. We often refer to the civil rights movement, and particularly the part of it that we think of with Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, et cetera, as nonviolent, right? We call that nonviolent resistance. When in fact, there's an incredible amount of violence that is faced by those protesting. The response to their activism is absolutely violent. So even the perspective on that means they are nonviolent protesters facing violent reactions to their protest. Right? That perspective and that shift of lens allows us to center the protesters and the experience that they have without eradicating their fullness of their humanity. Ideology. What powers our interest in a particular event? Sometimes we go to an event with questions. We go to this with questions. We go to the art with questions. We go to the book with questions. Right? And that's shaped by our ideologies, how we think about race, how we think about gender, how we think about class, how we think about home and ancestry. All of those things combine to the ways that when we hear about a historical event, we talk about it, how we engage it. And what Aminah Robinson's work offers us an opportunity to do is to, one, recognize that and reckon with the ways that power, perspective, and ideology shape how we understand history. But more than that, it offers us ancestry as one of the ways in, as a conduit in, as a way of thinking about how storytelling and those memories and those myths and those legends, it's not about whether they're true or not, it's about what they meant to those communities. And that meaning, coupled with history, enlivens the work in a very particular way and adds to what I see as what's been articulated as what the artist's responsibility is, particularly within minoritized and marginalized communities. So this is a longer quote, but some of you may be familiar here, of course, with the writer and Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes, and thinking about what the Black artist's responsibility is, how they do the work that they do. And he's referring to a particular moment when a poet writes to him and says to him, "I don't want to be a Black poet, I just want to be a poet," right? And in this response, right, he says, "But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race towards whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible." It is quite telling when you look at the work of Aminah Robinson that there's no mistaking where Blackness is in her piece. That how she takes this up is very much so rooted in particular ideas, experiences, ancestral legends, memories that are shaped by her experiences of both Blackness and the attendant anti-Blackness that she sees in her communities. This is important in terms of thinking about the urge to go towards a standardization, an urge towards going towards a form or a genre or one way of presenting our art that would be legible within American standardized forms. She resists that. She creates her own forms, forms within forms, forms on top of forms, right? If you've seen her work, there is a richness, a density to it that invites you to consider that as metaphor for Black life and culture. That at once is not this monolithic, simple understanding that's not simply just Black people, there was slavery, there was Dr. King, and here we are. But rather, there's Blackness in the moments where we're in our kitchens cooking and talking with one another, when we're getting our hair done, when we're walking down the street, when we're protesting, when we're loving on one another, when we're hugging one another, when we disagree with one another. Right? It is in those multitudes that Aminah Robinson's work resides, in the plenitude of Blackness, right? Not the absence of multiple stories, but the abundance of. Some of the themes that came out for me pretty directly within this, and I think are themes that continue to resonate in particular ways, is why her work is at one time so one moment very anchored in particular moments, but remains timeless, because these themes that she's picking up on are part of a universal, and in particular, a Black universal engagement. Family, home, ancestral roots, right? Traveling, there's mobility in her. There's a way that static comes to mind often when people think about communities, but she's pulling from and telling us that there are roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, that Black folks have traveled that help us understand our O-O-T-S roots, right? It is the parallel journey of those things, right? Women, if you get a chance again, I'm gonna just keep saying, please go see. But the way that she depicts women in her life, the love practice that she has within how she engages all people in her works, but there's this attentiveness to women and the form of women that's in her work and the stories of women in these stories, right? It is a refusal of the flattening of only the experiences of one gender are present in the Black experience. It is all Black genders' experience within this that she's highlighting. Racial and social injustice, hope, and vitality. One of the things that struck me in thinking about the denseness of her work, and by denseness, I mean literally the layering that happens, right? The texturing that happens in her work, is that when I tend to think of weight and density, I think of being weighed down or lethargic, right? Unable to move, inert. But there's such vitality and movement in the work that she presents that's attempting to mirror something that's being given by the very subjects she's capturing. It is the liveliness of community that she's talking about, whether it's in Poindexter Village that she's depicting, right? Or on a street in Columbus. There's something about using that texture to make these subjects come to life, that makes their lives come to life, that defies the constriction of their lived experience as this particular moment in time, but allows them to exist outside of it, right? That she's able to capture in this work. Oh, and there's an incredible amount of hope in her work. And I don't mean hope in the kind of hokey way that like, I hope things get better kind of way, because that would diminish the true impact of what I think hope has. I'm thinking here of hope in the terms of writer Miriam Kaba and activist Miriam Kaba, where hope is a discipline. Hope is an everyday discipline that you get up and you're committed to, that you continue to believe in, that you continue to move towards, not because of anything you've seen that's shown that it would be otherwise, but because you have a deep and abiding belief that otherwise is possible. And so you see the depths and the contours of the current moment, and you refuse to be bound in imagination, right? That is part of the work. That is the centering of a community in her work that defies any kind of narrowness that anyone would assign. Well, it's all Black life. Well, so much of it is Columbus, and there are these themes and these recurring people. And it's a refusal to see the abundance in that, the hope she saw in including every kind of detail she could in enlivening that community. Right, in those pieces, that hope and vitality structure and provide this kind of moving skeletal framework from which her work arises. One of the most important things of this exhibit for me was this incredible balancing that's done throughout her work, right? And I don't like to nod to balance because we tend to be like, you need a work-life balance, right? When we talk about balance, which most of us know is pretty impossible to achieve, but rather the ways we move between things that feel competing or at odds with one another, and how you use art to resolve and re-engage those things. And so I thought about that, the richness of her work, and as I mentioned before, the roots in her work, where it travels and where it's anchored, where she feels at home at and where she creates home, right? So there's not this feeling of displacement that's offered by this, but rather of exploration, right? Which is very much so linked to being a subject of the African diaspora, the forced dispersion of a people, that home often is a creationary place rather than one that is fixed, but always one that is being made and remade. And so she's dealing with the notions of deprivation and vitality, communities that have been starved and wrenched, right? Whether we're thinking about deprivation in terms of what economic policies do to communities, right? Being cut off from resources, but still seeing the vitality of a community in spite of that. But Aminah Robinson, in her work, is never allowing that deprivation to be a point of saying, here's a pathologizing narrative about Black life. Here's a narrative about Black life that is only about the dehumanization of Black life. No, instead, she asks us, Black people cannot be dehumanized. Right? My work shows that. There can be policies that attempt to show that are deeply inhumane. And in spite of that inhumanity, we see vitality. We see communities banding together, being down together in these desperate situations, in these hard-wrought situations, and finding life with one another. Right? We often hear the term now as a colloquialism that something gave us life, right? But thinking about the ways that communities and work that's coming out of those communities breathe life into, and then the work itself is breathing that life back as a reflection, as a reflexive of that kind of vitality, right? Bondage and freedom. She does not ignore the dank and dark spaces to which Black lives have been subjugated. And contrary to current pushes and current efforts to have us not think about the inglorious parts of our history, she is asking us to look at the humanity of those who were in bondage. She is asking us not just to see the ship and the bodies that are on the ship, if you're looking at some of her artwork that directly depicts the transport from the coast of Africa to the Americas, but to see that even in these moments, these people are living and breathing in flesh embodiments of possibility, that they're already plotting on resistance. They're already plotting on the new cultural worlds they will mine in this new and unfamiliar place. That they, in fact, are the labor that makes the new world possible. Right? And in seeing that notion of bondage here is not one that she rests at the feet of African Americans of these people were done unto, right? She depicts the enslaved, the condition of slavery, and what that journey to freedom looks like, right? So it's this balance of both unfreedom and freedom that she's working with, and asking us the question of what that freedom can look like in the face of that. So while bondage absolutely has this strong and lasting impact, because very much so her work is aligned with the work of historian Sadia Hartman when she talks about the afterlife of slavery, right? And it's multiple ways that that shows up, that freedom also is something that is a practice and ongoing. It is not a given. It is not something that we've arrived at yet. But the work shows the possibility of what freedom looks like. It's in those communities, right? It's on those corners, it's in front of those stores, it's in front of those venues that she depicts. It's in the abundance of life that's created in spite of. And that brings us to abundance and scarcity, right? Aminah's work is so wonderfully abundant. And by that I mean there's literal abundance if you look at the work, right? Of the things, the objects, the materiality of the work itself. But the kinds of themes, who's in there, who she's in conversation with, the movements that she's in conversation with, her work being used by organizations like CORE during the civil rights movement, right? There's an abundance that she's given to that in spite of the scarcity, in spite of the lack of resources that are often afforded to communities, in spite of the lack of attention often afforded artists, right? And especially Black women artists. That she is not creating something out of nothing, because what she's telling, I'm creating something and something more from something. She's asking us to see the something of communities, right? That focus in on Columbus, that focus in on Columbus at different moments throughout history that's in her work is reminding us that there's always been something, even when it's been read as nothing, right? And so it is not a project of saying of absence or lack, right, necessarily, even though that is what policy is offering, that these communities are always operating from this principle of more, right? And creating more possibility. She also asks us to look back, right? Sankofa, right, in her work. It's an Akan word from Ghana. And the literal translation of this is, it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. Right? Which is a little different from the kind of more well-known version of looking back to go forward, right? That it's not taboo to fetch. That's not just looking back, that's taking something with you, right? That you are probably able to take the past with you in particular ways. And so often we're running from a past, we're running from it because it includes this deprivation, this scarcity, this inhumanity, right? This anti-Blackness, this anti-womanness. All of these things are possible, but she's asking us, what was created in those moments? What did enslaved communities create? What did communities under Jim Crow create? Businesses, community centers, organizations, clubs, resistance, struggle, all of that is happening even in the presence of that which is damning, that which is harmful and violent and murderous even at times. So there's something that is at risk if you don't bring that along with you, right? Which also again taps into that ancestral part of this. That when we say something like, you are your ancestors' wildest dreams, right? Off-sided, now t-shirt branded kind of colloquialism. If we take that at a deeper level of meaning, what do we imagine our ancestors dreamed of? And all of us in this room have a different set of ancestors, right? And so that would ask us to say, what are the things they created and what did they create that for so that otherwise could be possible in a future? So to bring our ancestors along with us means to bring their dreams into fruition or to create new worlds for future generations to do that. Part of that is also recognizing that we who sit here are right now doing ancestor work, because someday soon we will all be somebody's ancestors. So the work that we do today, the work that she created, the place that she created, the spaces that she created with her work are for a future she never got to see, right? But we all are doing that work because we're imagining beyond us. We're imagining beyond what's here, which speaks to the kind of preternatural and supernatural elements of her work as well, right? An ability to think beyond, to think alongside, and to think back. It defies time, right? Who knew that artwork could give us a time machine in a very different kind of way? In the exhibit, there's also a brief mention, right, of and a framing of this idea of the desperate burden of being poor. Right? This is the narrative that's there. And one of the many things that comes up for me in reading this work is Robinson's refusal of a singular reading of her neighborhood, right, of her community, racial and social injustice, or the resistance that arises around that. And I saying here, right, the burden of being poor, again, to ask what comes out of those communities, what comes out of those neighborhoods, what is so dynamic about these neighborhoods in spite of deprivation, alienation, eventual social isolation, right? All of the Asians that start to happen, right, with regards to Black areas, particularly here in Columbus, right? But all around the nation at a certain point that we see this withdrawal from the city. We see this divestment from these communities. And this becomes a really important way to think about refusing a singular kind of framing of that there's an abundance of life, even if we look in these images of the way that resistance is playing into the narrative, that neighborhood is playing, that you'll see chickens in a lot of these images, right? Things that are brought from the past as they're migrating from the south to the north, but are still part of the landscape here, creating new landscapes for new possibilities for Black life, right? This refusal of a singular reading also refuses a singular kind of doling out of where power resides. That Aminah's work gives us a space to see power residing in this community. But perhaps we need to redefine what we mean by power in order to see that. That we not just see it in terms of electoral politics or who's in this space or not, but the power to create connections among community, to be of service to one another, to fill in the needs that have not been met within your radius, right? There's something dynamic about that, which is not to say that you can't have critiques, or you should have critiques, in fact, of the very policies that make it necessary for communities to operate in this way. But that in spite of those things, there is life and otherwise possible. And with this, you have this incredible commitment, right, to the complexity. One of the things that struck me as I prepared for this presentation today and went for my third time to view the exhibit was I didn't know where to begin, kind of fill in the middle, or anything, because each work opens up space to do so much work as somebody reading it. There are so many stories contained in one piece of art that she is offering. And it made me think of some of the qualities that stuck to this, right? For me, that density that I mentioned earlier, that there's a weightedness to this, but a weightedness that doesn't feel heavy per se, but a weightedness that allows you to peel back and dig in, to take a little bit at a time and engage and process and think through. That there's a layering of this. And I think about this as in conversation with different kinds of Black artists, right, who use layering as technique, whether we're thinking about the invention of harmony, three-part harmony that we are deeply indebted to Mattie Moss Clark, founder of the Clark sisters, mother of the Clark sisters, for the layering of sound, right, in particular ways. Or if we think about polyrhythmic music, music that grapples with different kinds of sounds moving at different times and meters, right, that are layered into one another. or a genre that I love, like hip hop and rap music in particular, that samples and layers multiple sounds at once to create one song, one moment. And with this multi-layering in her work, you get to see different materials, you get to see different stories, you get to get different feels, different evocations of moment that are part of this. And the texture of it. Now, you know you're not supposed to touch a lot of things in art museums, but my goodness, how much you want to touch some of the works when you see Aminah Robinson's work, because you just know that there's a story in the textures that have been chosen, in the materials that have been chosen, the field that's been chosen. There is something deeply multisensory about her work. I can smell certain moments. I can taste certain things cooking. I can hear what the block sounds like that she's depicting. Obviously, I can see what's here, but even that seeing depends on our position going into that seeing. So what I see when I look at this versus what you may see is deeply impacted by our own stories and our own encounters with community. So at the same moment that this is giving you so much to take in, part of what she allows us to do is because she gives us a mirror to tell our own stories too, with that, with the textures, with the layers, with the multisensory approach. And that abundance, whew, it is something that people will see this, and I have so many feelings about this in the best way possible, that it causes an abundance of feelings because I want to know, how did you get here? Right? I just want to know, how did you get here? Right? And it's life in Poindexter Village. And that's what's sewn in here. You can't see. And there's so much that's happening and so many different materials. It just makes me want to sit with her. But then I can't, so I have to convene with what I believe, what I think, what I've experienced. I can put it in conversation with her work. I can put it in conversation with art I've seen before. But no matter what, I have an abundance of possibility from what she offers us. Again, another metaphor here for Black life, the abundance of possibility when we look for complexity, when we look at it not as something that's about tensions or competing or excesses, but really that in an excess, in an abundance, is multiplicity and multitudes, which are our stories, which are part of our history. The other part that struck to me as we think about this conversation and our initial conversations about how we were framing this talk really spoke to some of what's happening in the world right now with regards to how we teach difficult histories and how we talk about race and racism, how we talk about oppression, how we talk about inequity and injustice, right? And it seems almost impossible to talk about the history of the United States without reckoning with race. It's impossible to talk about even things happening right now without that same kind of reckoning, right? It's impossible to talk about COVID without thinking about race. It's impossible to talk about maternal morbidity without talking about race. It's impossible to think about our world in such narrow ways that elide the very categories that have structured our worlds. And so in this, you see this moment of creating art out of these moments, these incredible, in many ways painful, horrific, inhumane, inglorious moments of this history, and saying, we will not forget this. In fact, we're taking it with us. So we can say that we will not do this again. Or look at what's happening again, right? Look at the ways we're repeating parts of this history, whether that be the Middle Passage, right, and the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved labor, the Great Migration, which of course plays an incredible part of Aminah's work of people moving, African Americans moving from the South of the United States to the North, to the Midwest, and to the West, by the millions, right? Literally restructuring what the United States looks like as a result of that. But we tend to learn about the Great Migration as something that's about African Americans as opposed to the reshaping of a nation. Because now you have, right, Black people moving into these cities throughout the country. Right? The urbanization of cities is in large part due to this migration of both Black people and immigrants, right, who are coming into the country in the 19th and 20th century. Right? Jim Crow segregation and what that means. So on one hand, we have the Jim Crow that we know as the violent force of putting Black folks in a very particular place within society and barring them from other places, right? Whether it's public transportation, schools, etc. And then we have these landmark cases, Brown versus Board, Voting Rights Act, all this. But she's asking us to see for a second some of the glory and the inglorious, because Black teachers, Black principals, Black schools that valued and affirmed Black children primarily are closed or restructured after Brown versus Board. That some of the same people who had been in communities, living in communities, working with communities, being present in these communities, right, are now no longer the front line with youth, are no longer providing that affirmation. So it's not to say, let's go back to Jim Crow, but interrogate what are the things that were created during Jim Crow by Black communities that remain of value to us. So depicting the Jim Crow era both as one of incredible vitality, creativity, and abundance in Black life, as well as one of deprivation, violence, and of resistance, right? That she is not positioning Black life as solely reactionary, right? But one that is consistently creationary and evolving, right? As opposed to only being responsive to what's being done to Black communities. And also the reality of anti-Black racial violence that accompanies this, and how communities rely upon one another to keep each other safe in the face of this. Right? But how violence shows up in the work is in many ways showing the nonviolence within the communities that she inhabited, showing how these communities chose love practices, chose to be with one another, and railed against violence being a part of their story, right? That shows up as well. I sat at the floor for 30 plus minutes at The Gift of Love. You walk into the exhibit. It is one I'll probably go sit at when I leave here today. But the tribute to those she was loved by and loved is something that just strikes you again, seeing the range of Aminah's work in terms of form and what she's crafting, right? What's part of her large body, huge body of work, written and visual, right? That comes out of this. But that when you enter into that space, and one of the ways we're able to rag on, to press forward, to keep pushing, to keep moving, is because you know around you are your ancestors, your family, the community, and the joy you have because of that. When you sit there and you see this gift of love, right? She's also telling you that Black life, Black living, Black culture is a gift of love. Doesn't mean love is perfect. That doesn't mean love is just this amorphous thing, but it's this thing, this practice of accountability. Love is what justice looks like when actualized. Right? That there's an abundance and a presence of connection and community that sits there. And one that when I left the exhibit, even looking at images of the Middle Passage, Jim Crow and protests and all of that, I left with joy. Joy that this woman had created this testament to Black life and living. Joy that this woman knew that her community was as rich as any other place in the world, that it had endless possibility for what could be mined. and not mined in an extractive, take it out, show it to other people way and commodifying or consumptive way, but one that could be mined for truths, for power, for a roadmap, for a path, for a way to think about how do we keep changing the world? How do we keep evolving? That she knew in Poindexter Village and Columbus, there was possibility for something life-changing and world-changing, universe-changing, ancestral plane-changing. And she committed to that and anchored there. Right? The fact that Aminah Robinson's work is so deeply rooted in Columbus has never left me as someone who first encountered her when I became an Ohioan temporarily. Right? It never left me. In fact, it gave me a sister that I didn't know to have, right? A sisterhood formed with particular artists, a sisterhood that gave me a roadmap of how to engage, what I might see, what I might feel, what I might smell, what I might taste, what I might experience as a Black woman beginning her journey in Ohio. She offered that, and then she offered that at such a large level, because there's an incredible amount of giving that's in each piece of this work. A giving of history, a giving of self, right? A giving of family, a giving of possibility, a giving of the most painful moments as well as those that are the most joyous. Right? That she leaves us with a gift, and so it's so fitting that you would enter the space into the gift that she offers us. Aminah is also an alchemist. I saw this word in the exhibit and I was like, yes, that's exactly what I think she is. A conjurer, right? A conduit to the ancestral plane, to the past and to the future, her work. She is defiant of category. I dare you to try and categorize her work. It'd be very difficult to do, impossible, intentionally so. But it is anchored in shared family, truths of family and neighborhood and community, a realization that there are multiple truths that are held within these places, within these spaces, that should be told, and invites you to tell yours too. I see her work as an invitation for us to tell our stories, an invitation to talk to our families, our communities, and share our truths alongside her. She is at once this incredibly accomplished artist, and I can't do 1/1000th of what she was able to do. And yet when I see her work, I feel inspired to do the things that I am skilled at doing with this kind of layering and nuance and complexity. Because we need this kind of work to push back against those who would say we need to forget this history. We need to not have difficult dialogues. We need to just move on from the past. She invites us to fetch from the past. And combining forms and materials, right? You're bringing all this together, right? Sampling, which again, people tend to think of as somehow just hip hop related, but has this incredible tradition throughout the diaspora of what sampling can mean. To bring in multiple forms, multiple modes, multiple sounds, multiple movements, to bring them all together to tell a story. To tell several stories all at once, and then to allow you to tell a story from those stories. Aminah's work is as much about what she did as what she gives us permission to do with that. So what is Raggin on? How do we get there, and how do we do that? For me, it was to persevere and create like Aminah did, to build and rebuild like Aminah did, to imagine and dream as Aminah did, and her work shows us, and to hope as a discipline, to hope even when it seems impossible, to always know that the creationary possibilities are right there for us to touch and for us to imagine. It is asking us to unbound our imagination, to deal with the difficult so that we are loving more abundantly, that we are hoping more abundantly, that we are creating more abundantly and beyond even our own imaginations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Treva Lindsay. That was awesome, inspiring. And we want to welcome questions from the floor. My name is Deidre Hamler, and I'm one of the co-curators of the Raggin exhibition. Who has a question for us? All right, I'm going to bring the mic to you if you don't mind.
I think there's one right there.
Hello and good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you.
I would love to know about how Aminah's work has inspired you as an artist
Yes.
and just the impact it's had on you. I actually saw one of her books and I immediately recognized it from my childhood, and I actually hadn't made the connection that she's the artist who made this book. I'm actually from Cleveland, so I also didn't know that she was from Columbus, so definitely making a lot of connections. So I would love to know
Yes.
from your perspective what those connections are for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So one, as I say, I'm not a visual artist. I did grow up as a dancer. That was kind of my art form, but I'm a writer. And what was so wonderful in seeing this exhibit at this point is Carol mentioned when she introduced me, I just finished a book about violence against Black women. And it's a recent history of that. And one of the things that Aminah's work that I'm going to do, one, was to not be afraid to put my story into that story. That I was used and was trained as a historian to have distance in certain ways. So even though I wrote about Black women in Washington, D.C., I wasn't talking about like my family in D.C. I was thinking about the city broadly and how Black women shaped it. This gave me permission to say, the reason I want to write this book is because I have, as a Black woman, have experienced violence. And I want to understand what that means and how to do that. And so Aminah Robinson is one of the people that I look to for a model of how to do that, for how to touch on these big themes, these big ideas. So right, for her, it's Jim Crow, it's, segregation, it's all of this, but never lose sight of the most intimate ways we can do that. And so I consider Aminah Robinson one of the best intimate historians. And I seek to have work that reads and resonates as intimate history. And so her work is not just asking us to bear witness to a thing. In my book, I talk about bearing witness to the joy, the pain, the trauma, the love, the frustration. And so her work for me is a model for what it looks like to bear witness and witness to Black life.
Thank you.
There's one right here. Yes.
Thank you. What do you take to mean the disproportionately large hands in so much of her artwork? I didn't see that, unless I missed it, I didn't see that spoken to in any of the descriptors, and I'm so interested to know what your take on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you what I take away from it, which is the incredible thing again about art and what our art does. But I'm always feeling presence around it, right? The ways that I think about my grandmother's hands, I think about connection, and that the hand just gets bigger as people move on from space. So the hand on me now is my great-great-great-grandmother, it's my grandmother, it's my father. It's one of my good friends, right? The hand just gets bigger and bigger because it's part of that ancestral presence and legend, but there's something that's holding you up and pushing you forward, right? So that for me was one of the things when I saw it, it resonated on that level. And I just thought about that song, Bill Weathers, Grandma's Hands, right? And there's an active, right? It's a memory of that practice of all of the ways that nurtures and cares, but that hand gets bigger and bigger with every generation, of who's pushing us forward and who's holding us, even in the moments where we feel alone. Yeah. Hands, yes, yes. And it's such a powerful declaration, right, of people whose bodies literally are owned. And to be able to say, these are mine, right? I choose what to do with them. And those hands have that ushering, that conjuring, right? All of these different verbs I use of conjuring, of building, of creating. These are things that are very tactile and can be done with the hand. But you need a big hand to hold, right? All of those things. You need a big hand to capture that abundance.
Are there any other questions?
There's one right here. Oh, great. I didn't see that one. Sorry, back there.
Professor, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm not really happy with the term critical race theory.
Okay.
And if you have thought about it, do you have another suggestion? And how about just untaught race history instead of critical race theory? It sounds like theory means it's anyone's guess. And
Gotcha.
critical means that somehow it's criticizing race or the theory. So
Okay.
untaught race history.
Okay. So a couple of things. Thank you for that question. And I think it's a question that's been on a lot of folks' minds here. So one, I think the second part of what you said about untaught histories of race or untaught or misunderstood, misinterpreted, mistold, wrongly told history is one part of that, of how we talk about that. What critical race theory in its outset is doing, right, is coined by Derek Bell and later fleshed out by Kimberly Crenshaw, who also gave us the term intersectionality as a term, is this very critical legal studies term, right? It's actually not about history, right? The term itself is really dealing with how race, and initially in the law, shows up, right? Race and racism in the law shows up, right? That's the very foundational kind of simple rendering. I'm doing a terrible disservice to Derek Bell here, but is understanding how race was impacting these different legal outcomes. And you can't do that without understanding the history of the legal system, right? And how it's been built. And so the theory that was being used at the time in law schools gave us a lens into understanding how the law was disparately applied, right? And so you see higher sentencing, you'd see more people on death row who were Black and people of color. You'd see disproportionate kind of sentencing depending on what the race of the victim was. So critical race theory was like, let's look at what race does as a factor in determining outcomes. And being able to do that means looking at the history of racism, right? And understanding how that history still impacts what we're doing today. And I know both critical and theory sometimes get people like critical, right? Which you said as critique, but it's saying the law warrants critique because it's rooted in ideas about race and then rooted in racism in ways that produces different outcomes for different communities, right? So for me, I think we need both. We need both how we understand these things, and we need that history. That I think history and theory actually have to work together to do things, but I think most people who engage critical race theory, I didn't get critical race theory until I got to graduate school and took a class called critical race theory. I think in K through 12, what we often see is how students encounter what race is meant and how race has changed, not changed, racism has shifted and not shifted, and what that means for particular communities. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. All right, we have another question.
You're moving through this audience, dude.
All right.
No.
I really don't have a question, but I want to ask you, one of my favorite words is hope.
Yes.
And what you said about hope, can you repeat that?
Yes, sure.
I love
So
that.
my definition of hope is indebted to Miriam Kaba, and it's hope is a discipline, right? It is a practice of moving forward in the belief that otherwise is possible, in spite of any evidence that suggests otherwise, right? So how one moves forward. And so you have to move with that knowledge that the thing that you're imagining, you're gonna run up against some things that tell you, and all of the evidence may be telling you that thing is impossible, which is why you have to remain disciplined in your approach to that.
Thank you.
You're
Excellent.
welcome.
Excellent.
We need you.
Okay. I have a couple of comments. First of all, thank you.
Yes.
You did a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I met my husband working in Poindexter Village.
Mm.
We were both college students. He was from Capital, I was from OSU.
Mm.
And your comment about perspective, when I look at that picture, I see what Aminah saw.
Mm.
This is not what we saw. I mean, we saw the people, we saw everything that's there. It's amazing. It put a whole new perspective on what children see.
Yes.
You know, we always say kids see stuff, don't do it. It's amazing. You also gave me a new appreciation, I gotta say another appreciation for the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
When you talked about the migration
Yes.
and needing each other. What is it? I can't think of her name now, but she held teas during the Harlem Renaissance. All Black people come into tea. Almost everything you said,
Yes.
I'm gonna remember. I can't remember what I had for lunch today, but I will
All right. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And you're so right. There's just that community and that basing in that. And as you said, with the Harlem Renaissance, one of the things that I wrote about in my first book was about DC during that time period, right? Because so many places that had Black populations at that point had essentially this kind of new Negro movement, right? It was not singular to New York. I'm always pushing New York out the center, say there are other cities that matter in this conversation, DC being one of them, my hometown, but certainly in Columbus, in Chicago, in Philly, in Baltimore, in Los Angeles, in Columbus, right? That there's a vibrancy, there's community, there's salons that are being held where writers are sharing work and having teas. There's all this happening in the still evolving beauty shop culture that's emerging at this period, and the barbershop culture that's emerging in this period. There are things happening when people playing dice games or running numbers, right? All of these things are part of the fabric of a community. And Aminah Robinson was like, y'all are gonna see Columbus, right? And more importantly, you're gonna see Poindexter Village. In that conversation, and what it meant to her and what its legacy is in the context of Columbus and the broader narrative about Blackness in the United States.
Thank you. Are there any final questions? One more? All right.
So firstly, I just want to say that was amazing.
Thank you.
I usually have trouble paying attention when somebody is talking for that long, but I was like sitting on the edge of my seat. I was hanging on every word you said. So good job. But I just want to ask, I sometimes have trouble feeling motivated creatively and in general,
Yes.
knowing that I don't know, just being faced with being a woman in a man's world and all the ways that that appears to me in my daily life. And that's not even dealing with the misogynoir of like being Black and a woman in a white man's world. So I know that I struggle with feeling motivated creatively, and
Yes.
I'm not even dealing with the other side of it. And so I just want to know, how do you stay motivated and keep going and not feel weighed down like you were talking about and just hopeless? 'Cause
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that very vulnerable question. So I don't want to pretend that I don't ever get weighed down. I don't want to be dishonest about that. The majority of this last project I wrote during COVID. I wrote after the loss of my father, which had an incredible weight for me. My dad was like the original girl dad, if you ask me. And that practice of feeling like there are these systems that telling me I shouldn't be creating, that my voice doesn't matter, that my story is unimportant, and the status of being minoritized, whether that's through gender, through race, through sexuality, through disability, through language, right? There are all of these categories of that. They can really do a number on your psyche. And so part of what I take from Aminah Robinson, from other artists who inspire me, is that grounding in the community, in the folks who are willing to love you and care for you abundantly. So those moments when I'm feeling fear, or I'm angry, or I'm frustrated, or I feel like I just can't do the thing, I go back to my people, right? And finding who your people are in terms of that lane is really important as an artist, as a writer, as a creator. The people who know the vision that you have and are committed to you actualizing that vision. And so you don't do that alone. There's no, I did this book, I wrote this, I wrote that. That's a whole community about me. It's why like my acknowledgements are like 10 pages, right? Because there's that hand, that big hand, but sometimes you need to go to the hand and say, I need you. And so the part of the vulnerability of your question is you've already proven in a very public space that you can be vulnerable about the thing that you feel that you need. Sometimes it's harder to be that kind of vulnerable with the people who actually have to be accountable to that. And so as an artist, I encourage you to, as strongly as you're working on your art, making sure that your village that's around you, that's going to be that hand, is ready and willing when you go to them in those moments. And write or create about those moments too. Like, I'm frustrated, I don't know what to do. Write that, dance that, sing that, draw that, paint that. Something with that. There's something in there, because right there you're telling us about the ways that sexism is operating, even when it has to do nothing. It's living in your mind rent-free, right? So now you have to give space for other things to live with that. And sometimes we need help doing that. And it's okay to say that, and it's okay to reach and ask and want to be held warmly by those who see your vision of you and the vision of the work you want to create.
Thank you so much.
Treva, thank you so much. I'm almost in tears. You know, I really am, because you just have said it in such a beautiful way, and you just captured Aminah. And you know, there are just so many ways when you talk about the hairdressers. You know, she did a whole series about hairdressing because her grandmother was a hairdresser.
Yes.
And there's just all the little things, and then the big picture too, about how we all have these important stories. You know, Aminah did this series that are in the exhibition called Button Beaded Books, and she would hand people a book. She didn't want you to actually write, but she wanted you to think about your story.
Yes.
And somehow tell it to someone.
Yes.
You know, carry it on. And I just think you have just captured her spirit in such a beautiful way. I'm really glad we recorded this, because I know there are a lot of other people that would really, will really enjoy it. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank
and
you. Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming. Yes. where it needs to